the Sultan terminated the parliament in November 1918, which kind of paved the way, as Murat was saying, for a nationalist parliament to then emerge later on in Ankara to basically say, up yours to the Sultan, we're not having this. And it's the harshness of that treaty and the refusal of people like Ataturk, and the fact that they still had an army, and the fact that Russia was in the grip of a civil war, which neutralized that whole flank, meant the Turks could galvanize and come back and pull back a complete unimaginable recovery, really. Ataturk, this is a guy who is fundamentally unknown in this country. Ataturk in Britain, he's kind of, he's hugely influential. As Murat said, the Turkey we see today is fundamentally the Turkey that he gave us.
Hello. On the 1st of September 1922, the Turkish Parliament in the new capital of Ankara formally abolished the Sultanate, so ending more than 600 years of Ottoman rule. The Ottoman Empire had ended, but in its place came the Republic of Turkey under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal Pasha, also known as Ataturk. Today we discuss the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the rise of Turkey with the historian Murat Siviloglu and journalist and author Alec Marsh. Alec's new book, After the Flood, is a thriller set in the state of Turkey in the 1930s, and Murat is a historian of the period. Coming up, we have plenty more great history to come, including the SAS in Italy, the liberation of Paris, Hitler's cronies, and much, much more. So please do subscribe or follow if you're listening on Spotify or Apple, and if you can give a generous rating, that'd be most kind. But in the meantime, it's me talking with Murat and Alec on the fall of the Ottoman Empire. Alec, you're returning, and Murat, welcome all the way from Turkey.
Thank you very much.
Anatolia.
Absolutely, it's a pleasure. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Good stuff. Right. Okay. So we're talking about the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and the reason for that is the main reason for that, Murat, is Alec's new book that is out, his fourth Drabble and Harris thriller, After the Flood. And it looks like, Alec, there's a bit of a revamp, got a new cover, and you're heading east this time for this book. But the reason for Murat being here, we are going to Turkey. And so in that vein, I wanted to get you on to discuss an important subject that I don't think we've really addressed in any great detail on the podcast, which is the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And I was saying before we started recording with Murat that we had Giles Milton on to talk about the destruction of Smyrna, and so I can link that in as well for listeners. But really, I wanted to speak to you both because the Ottoman Empire, it's like one of those things, Murat, probably, in that people have said the Ottoman Empire was in decline for hundreds of years. And when it actually did happen, it happened fast. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, this is something that we are revisiting as historians, the question of Ottoman decline. I mean, the usual paradigm is that the Ottoman decline started in the 17th century. But of course, it doesn't really make much sense when you think about it, a decline of 300 years. So now the new idea is to see that phase as some sort of transformation, from a Istanbul-centered empire to a big network of local rulers, local grandees who had more saying in the governance of the empire from 17th century up until the 19th century. And then in the 19th century, again, we have this new centralization under Mahmud II. So there are different phases of the empire, but it is also very difficult to deny that from the 17th century onwards, the Ottoman Empire was not as militarily threatening as it was before. Like, for example, we have the emergence of Russia, and it became the Ottoman Empire's arch enemy. And from that point onwards, the Ottoman Empire stopped being a threat for the European powers.
I guess the best way to, I think, frame this is probably with the First World War, because I think most people will be familiar with the great powers in the First World War, in the Great War. And the Ottoman Empire, most particularly, has a a great success in defeating the British Empire on the Dardanelles Straits at Gallipoli. But the First World War really hastens, as I kind of alluded to when we started, really hastens the collapse of the empire, what with the Middle East. Was the First World War then clearly, despite Gallipoli, was not a great success for the empire?
I mean, if you look at the end result, yes, it was not a success. But when you look at the war as a whole, the whole theater, I think the tenacity with which people defended the empire is really astonishing. The Ottoman Empire was able to mobilize more than 1 million people. And, they were quite successful in different campaigns. Gallipoli is definitely the first one comes to mind. But also in the East, they were quite successful. And of course, this was not only due to the Ottoman military establishment. Germany supported the Ottoman war efforts in a significant way. And in that regard, the Ottoman Empire was the success of the Ottoman Empire in the First World War was also because of the support of the German military machine. But the Ottoman Empire did not collapse because of the First World War, but rather because of the conditions imposed to it after the war. I mean, when you look at the history of the Ottoman Empire in the last 300 years, they lost many wars, and some of them were probably more devastating. But I think it was a time when the empires were coming to an end. It was the same thing for the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The First World War was a bad thing happened to empires, I can say.
Yes, it certainly was. So, Alec, one significant figure who rises, really thanks, I don't know, we can, Murat, you can pick me up on this, is Ataturk, the great general during the Gallipoli campaign.
Yeah.
And really, he's a key figure for Alec, in your novel, which your novel actually is a little bit further forward than the period we're discussing right this moment. He's the main historical figure that you've based your story around.
Yes, exactly right. So After the Flood is set in 1938 in May. In actual fact, history is that in November 1938, Ataturk was dead. And that brought to an end 18 years of his effective rule, first as prime minister, then as president, in this brand new republic of Turkey, which was a new country formed out of this very ancient creature, the Ottoman Empire. And, to a very real extent, Ataturk inspires the kind of one of the main characters in the novel. But whereas Ataturk kind of birthed this modern nation through a prism of nationalism and Turkism, which was this sort of great notion that he embraced and was very popular amongst the officer class of the 1890s and early 1900s, about which Murat will know more than me. The villain, as it were, in my piece, is a kind of neo-Ottoman, someone who looks backwards and thinks the past can somehow help the future. But essentially, they are two different varieties of people, of how they responded to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And what happens when, in the case, for example, of Ataturk, you're born in Salonika, and then that stops being in the empire. So you become kind of dispossessed because Salonika left the Ottoman Empire, I think, in 1908 or 1912, part of the great kind of pell-mell rush of Balkan countries that left, and which caused the crisis that led to, for instance, in my opinion, the kind of erroneous decision to enter the First World War on the wrong side, or what turned out to be the wrong side. You'll have something to say about that. But there's obviously, if you look at the kind of treaty, the Congress of Berlin in 1878, and the role of the Prussians in orchestrating the kind of redrawing of the Balkans, and Turkey's place within that, keeping the Russians out. I mean, I wonder, is there a vein there between what Bismarck achieved and then really 1914, 1915, when Turkey enters the war on the side of the Germans, which of course has a fateful consequence for the empire, which at that point had lasted 600 years or so?
I think there were different fractions in the Ottoman Empire. Some wanted to stay neutral, some wanted to side with Britain. But I think the appeal of the German, I think one important factor was Enver Pasha. He was educated in Germany. He was a Germanophile. He spoke German quite well. and he impressed German officers as a capable Ottoman military general. So there were lots of relationships personally between Enver Pasha and German leadership. And I should perhaps mention that Enver Pasha was the leader of Young Turks who overthrew Abdülhamit in 1908.
And that's the big change, isn't it? Because when the Sultan gets deposed in 1909, 1908, Abdülhamit II.
It is the revolution, and the next year he was deposed. Yes.
And then you have this period of the Young Turks who are in charge, really, and they take the empire on this new course towards Germany.
Absolutely. I mean, the Young Turks, I think if we want to understand the Republic, we need to understand the Young Turks. Because, Mustafa Kemal is a great revolutionary, there's no question about that. But he was a product of his time. He was a Young Turk, he was educated in Ottoman schools, and all of his reforms were actually the results of the ideas which were discussed in those circles. But I should go back to the question of Germany and the appeal of Germany for the Ottoman. I think they wanted to strike back against their traditional enemy, Russia. So they did not want to be on the same side with Russia. When you look at the Ottoman history, again, in the last 300 years, almost all of its wars were against Russia. The Crimean War, especially the wars in the 18th century. They were devastating, they were very difficult. And Russia was this great enemy. So for the Ottoman elite, it would have been incredibly difficult to digest, to side with Russians against Germany.
It's one of those great, amazing what-ifs in history, because obviously it's the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 that spells the end, really, of that European empire for Turkey. And as you say, there's no way that they could 30 years later conceive of jumping into bed with the Russians. But it is interesting that the end of the war, I mean, having had a very good Caucasus campaign against the Russians during World War I, mean, there was losses, but then the Ottoman Empire kind of won back quite a lot of land. It's quite interesting to see that the collapse of the Russian Empire and the kind of emergence of the Soviet Union was obviously really beneficial to the Republic of Turkey, because suddenly my enemy's enemy is my friend, and the two could help each other out.
They became friendly. Yeah.
Exactly. And so one of the things I think is fascinating about Turkish history from our perspective on this side of the world in the UK, there's a thing called the Turkish War of Independence, which doesn't feature in British textbooks very highly, Murat. Like we don't know about this, and but of course this is a big part of the creation story of the Republic of Turkey. And it happened. It really happened between 1922 and 1923. Ataturk, Mustafa Kemal, led this resistance movement out of Ankara and drove the Greeks back by the British out of Izmir, as it is now, and in the other direction, and forged a new country. And I mean, what? I mean, I'm not in charge of this conversation.
Well, it sounds like you are, Alec. But I wanted to get to the war of independence. But before that, we should talk about what the Ottoman Empire looked like as a result of the Treaty of Versailles, because
it's the Treaty of Sèvres.
The Treaty of Sèvres.
Yeah, there's two treaties. The Treaty of Sèvres is the sort of
Versailles is Germany, Saint-Germain is Austria, and the Sèvres was the Ottoman one.
Wonderful. Thank you for correcting me. Clearly assumed that Versailles was a catch-all, but you're absolutely right. So, Murat, please enlighten. It sounds like you won't be enlightening Alec. You'll be enlightening me and perhaps some listeners.
It was an extremely harsh treaty. It can be compared to the Treaty of Saint-Germain, which was imposed on Austria-Hungary. So the Ottoman Empire not only lost, so there was no European provinces anymore. So the Europe completely gone, which was a very striking blow. As Alec reminded us, Mustafa Kemal was born in Salonika. He was from the European provinces. And you look at the Ottoman elite, I want to say most of them came from the European provinces, from Albania, Greece, Bulgaria in today's terms. were like the stronghold. I mean, this is something that I find extremely interesting. Bulgaria, parts of Greece and Romania, stayed within the Ottoman Empire longer than Iraq and Balkan Empire. Losing those European provinces was a big tragedy, definitely. But it did not stop there. Definitely the Middle Eastern parts of the empire also gone, which was another blow to the prestige of the Sultan, because, the Sultan was Sultan, but he was also a caliph, the protector of the Muslims. So during the First World War, of course, we have the Arab rebellion. The Sharif Hussein rebelled against the Ottoman authority, and he declared himself the caliph after the war. And of course, it did not go well with the Ottoman public opinion, because all of a sudden, the Ottoman Empire not only lost its European provinces, which had been the heart and soul of the empire for centuries, but also its, the Muslim provinces, which was a part of Ottoman legitimacy, being the protector of the two holy cities. And it did not stop there either. Most of the Anatolia was divided between the victorious powers. Greece had a significant chunk. And also Istanbul. I mean, losing Istanbul, I cannot imagine. Because when you look at the region in the 19th century, they were very much afraid of losing Istanbul. Istanbul was the apple of their eye. This big, great city. They realized that having Istanbul was really important, because for Ottomans, for many centuries, they were, I know it is very difficult to understand today, but they considered themselves as the continuation of the Roman Empire. As such, having the second Rome, Istanbul, or as they called it, Constantinople, was extremely significant. It's really funny when, it's now a big deal in Turkey. You cannot call Istanbul Constantinople.
It should be Byzantium, in my view.
Up until when you go back in time. But the Ottomans had no problem calling it Constantinople, the city of Constantine. They took certain pride in it. And losing Istanbul was also a significant blow. So the conditions of the treaty were very harsh. And for that reason, it was never ratified in the Ottoman Assembly, in the Ottoman National Assembly. And as a result, the Allies decided to stop the meetings. And this paved the way for the movement of Turkish independence.
Okay, so basically then really we're looking at a massive redrawing of the borders, and much of what we recognise of Turkey today is the result of the Treaty of Sèvres.
Well, not entirely, Ollie, because just to go back to good old the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which I think no discussion like this can take place without the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 between Britain and France, obviously. But assented to secretly, by Russia and Italy as well. And if you look at the line that gets drawn across the Middle East there, roughly kind of from Palestine up to Anatolia, with the top half below Anatolia going to France, the bottom half going to Britain, that is strikingly similar to the principal terms of the Treaty of Sèvres. And the crucial of 1918, which, as Murat has just explained, the Ottoman Parliament refused to accept. And I think I'm right in saying that the Sultan terminated the Parliament in December or November 1918, which kind of paved the way, as Murat was saying, for a nationalist parliament to then emerge later on in Ankara to basically say, up yours to the Sultan, we're not having this. And it's the harshness of that treaty and the refusal of people like Ataturk, and the fact that they still had an army, and the fact that Russia was in the grip of a civil war, which neutralized that whole flank, meant the Turks could galvanize and come back and do a pullback and a complete unimaginable recovery, really. Now, Murat, is that fair? Is my British version of 3 cool years in your history about right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, I mean, the Treaty of Sèvres was definitely not accepted. And because if the conditions were slightly better, I think it would have been, the history would have been completely different. But because they were so harsh, what they did was to leave just the heartland of Anatolia for a Turkish empire, a very Turkic-looking Turkish empire in the middle of Anatolia. And the modern Turkey was divided between various parties from France to Italy to Greece. So the idea either, but probably they felt desperate enough. But there were, as Alec pointed out, people coming back from the front, seasoned Ottoman commanders, who started to organize little pockets of resistance in various parts of Anatolia. And under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal, this became the national struggle for independence.
Okay, Murat, I wonder, the terms of the Treaty of Sèvres, is the reason for this, because if one looks at what the carve-out of the certainly western part of Turkey, modern-day Turkey, is, you know, there is a mix, a huge number of Greek populations along the western seaboard of Turkey. Were the terms imposed by the Western powers driven by the fact that you've got a lot of diplomats who've studied far too much classics and therefore decided, well, you know, we'll return borders to how it was during the Athenian Empire?
Yeah, I think it's very fair to say that, yes. And I mean, I think it is very debatable. But for example, in places like Smyrna, Izmir, the Greeks claimed that they had the majority. I'm not sure, but it was a very close call. So they had legitimate grounds to claim that it was part of their empire. And they thought that, you know, they saw it as an opportunity. I mean, who wouldn't? I'm not blaming Greeks. You know, I would have done the same thing. The Ottoman Empire was collapsing, and everyone was trying to grab something out of it. You know, the Kurds were trying to create some sort of Kurdish state. It was the same for the Armenians. It was the same for the Greeks. It was the same for the European powers. And probably they were better equipped to get what they wanted. Hence, we have the new borders in the Middle East, you know, places like Iraq and Syria. I mean, Syria was a country from the very beginning, but Iraq, I mean, it is a completely arbitrary creation. We are talking about 3 Ottoman provinces, which had nothing in common. You know, the half of the country is Shia, the half of the country is Arab, and you have a sizable Kurdish population. It was a state from the beginning. It was doomed. But, you know, they did not really care about that at that time. What they wanted was to have a hold in the Middle East because, as we know, oil was becoming extremely important. But there was definitely a lot of sympathy for the Greek cause. You know, people like Lloyd George always there. But they were not ready to support the Greek efforts to the end. I mean, we have to think about the public opinion. They were, after, you know, fighting 4 years to go and fight for the Greeks in Anatolia. So they supported the Greek idea, this megali idea, the great idea of a big Greek state. It was intellectually appealing to them, but they were not ready to support it militarily or logistically. And I think that was the great lack of the Turkish nation. The public opinion was not ready to support another war.
I mean, you can see it though, can't you? Because this is the era of, you know, President Wilson's 14 points of national self-determination. And across Europe, you've got places like the Czech Republic and, you know, all these countries just appearing, you know, with borders drawn around groups of people, you know, out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And clearly thought, well, you know, as you say, if there's a majority of people who have Turkish identity in a certain area, or we can draw a line around that and stick it onto, Greek, we can stick a line around that and give it to Greece. And then you've got people like Lloyd George, as you say, were intellectually attracted to the idea of it. And Bob's your uncle. They thought they'd give it a try. And the future is unknowable, you know, that's the thing, but the past is.
Well, we've mentioned the rise of the Young Turks and really Ataturk himself. So I wondered if we could just spend a few minutes on him. And I think you've mentioned, Alec, he's born in Salonika, region of Greece. So he's Greek, is what we're saying. And he is this brilliant general during the First World War. Murat's probably spitting with rage right now at that thought.
No. So look, I hope that I'm not, you know, I am beyond those things. But we should remember that there was a very big Turkish community. You know, it is almost meaningless to talk about genealogies in an empire like, you know, the Ottomans, because He might have been of Greek origin, and they might have converted into Islam at one point in the 16th and 17th centuries. He was coming from a Turkish family or a Turkic family who had resided in Greece for centuries.
You know how there's that strange quirk in history that Aquitaine in France was, technically part of England from, like 1200 through to, 1540 or something during the Wars of the Roses. So was a huge part of this our country. Well, these provinces, Turkey and Europe was a fact of political life from, the mid 1450s up to 1920. And that's kind of astonishing. That's a huge span of time. And as Murat said, there's obviously massive cultural fusion taking place in that time. And I think the fact of its departure.
Salonika was a Greek city. Salonika was a Turkish city. And Salonika was also a Jewish city. It was a great fusion of, as Alex said, a great fusion of cultures. People were living. It's very difficult not to feel a certain sense of nostalgia about it, because, obviously there were problems. Obviously there were intercommunal killings throughout the centuries. But especially now, when you think about the diversity and the richness of people living together for centuries, has a certain appeal to it. And I think Alec's book, is a result of that kind of rich understanding of the Ottoman Empire.
I've travelled up to that part of northern Greece, and yes, you definitely there are certainly remnants, even 100 years later. But coming out of the treaty and this carve up of the Ottoman Empire, was it always ripe for I hesitate to say sort of strong man, but I guess ultimately that's what he was. Was it his opportunism, or the circumstances were all there for a man of his ability to come in and lead a movement to create a new state?
I think he was a very ambitious man. He's very ambitious. We need to be careful. Even the Sultan, Mustafa Kemal was attached to Sultan at one point, and he was like, this guy is a bit dangerous. He's too ambitious. Definitely. The changes which happened from 1918 to 1930 would have been unthinkable under any other circumstances. But the war kind of created the perfect conditions for revolutionary changes. They got rid of the Ottoman dynasty, which had a huge legitimacy. They ruled. We are talking about the same family ruling over these people for 600 years. It's an incredible achievement for a place like the Middle East, because people come and go. There are people like Tamerlane, who comes in the 15th century, destroys everything, starts a new empire, and after his son, the empire collapsed. The tenacity of the Ottoman Empire was really, it's very difficult to understand from today's perspective. And they've been around forever as far as the Ottoman citizens were concerned. So getting rid of them, but not only that, also the caliphate and creating a secular state would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. And also changes like, for example, changing the alphabet. Can you imagine? You have this huge literature for 600 years. You are literate. The Ottoman language was a combination of Turkish, Persian, and Arabic. The script was Arabic or Persian. The vocabulary was peppered with Persian and Arabic words, depending on what you write. And I don't want to say over a night, but practically what it was, over a night, they changed the alphabet. People became illiterate. One day you are a university professor, next day you are an illiterate person. So those changes would have been extremely difficult under normal circumstances. And the war, by its big devastation, created the perfect ground for such a flower, let's say, to bloom.
And so the Greeks do decide to have a campaign into mainland Turkey. What are the exact circumstances of this war, which ultimately ends in a tragedy that I don't want to linger on too long, because we've discussed that elsewhere on Izmir? This really is almost the kickstart to the new state of Turkey. You get a great military victory, and then that makes Ataturk's position surely unassailable.
Yeah, absolutely. So part of that's the lag of the line. So once Ataturk has, driven back the Greeks and, essentially won the war, like Lenin in Russia, or indeed Napoleon, I guess, who was a great hero of Ataturk's, his position is unassailable. And I think, he's been a revolutionary since his 20s. And he's even dreamed of, getting rid of the empire and forging a new Turkey for as far back as 1906. So he's been thinking about this for a long time. And when the empire is essentially destroyed by the Treaty of Sevres and the 325,000 dead in the Great War, it's going to lose all the European holdings. So it loses all its sort of those Christian states. It's lost its position, as Murat said, as defender of Islam, a position it's held, the caliphate, since 1517. It's had that. So it's been driven right back to Anatolia. And so the kind of conditions are right there for a man who believes in the Turkish dream to restore that. And as I said, the victory against the Greeks seals that.
Murat, do you have anything to add there?
Maybe I should say a few things about, what the Greeks were thinking. So, as I said, this was a great opportunity for them. There was a certain division in Greece between, King Constantine I and Venizelos. Venizelos was an ambitious man from Crete, and he saw this as a great opportunity. Istanbul was really important for the Ottomans, but perhaps equally important, or even more important for the Greeks, the Constantinople, this great city. And if they were going to establish a Greek empire, the capital needed to be Constantinople. And if they were going to get Constantinople, this was the perfect opportunity. Constantine I did not want to get into the war. He had mixed feelings. Of course, he was coming from a German family, like the House of Oldenburg. But Venizelos felt differently, and eventually he was able to push Greece at a strategic moment into the war. As the Ottoman Empire was falling, the Greeks thought this a golden opportunity. They did not, I think, they underestimated the Turkish resistance and the tenacity of the Ottoman army, even after the 4 years of total warfare.
Yes, I think Greeks probably, when fighting the East, should really take defensive postures, such as will be familiar to ancient historians. So you've talked about some of the reforms, particularly around language and, the development of a new alphabet. And what were the other reforms? I think most famously, we're probably all aware of a secular Turkey, which I guess that's probably more revolutionary than a language change.
The evolution of the caliphate, and they removed caliphate from the political authority, and it became I think the idea was he was going to be the Pope of the Muslims in a city like Vatican, somewhere in Turkey. But that did not last for long. It's very difficult to know if this was the original ideal in politics and they decided to get rid of him. But my feeling is that from the very beginning, they wanted to get rid of him because he was too much of a liability. And there would have been people like General Siviloglu in Alec's book to bring back the Ottoman Empire. And he would have been, very appealing as a candidate. So that was huge, abolishing the caliphate. We are talking about a very conservative society, and just sending the last caliph to Europe in exile was a major blow to conservatives, something that it is still an important deal in Turkey. One of the things that if you have a conversation with a conservative Turk, one of the things that they would say, what about the abolition of the caliphate? What about the translation of call to prayer, azan, had been in Arabic for centuries, and Mustafa Kemal got it translated into Turkish, something that they never forget. It was also a very big deal. And also equal rights to women. Before many European countries, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk gave equal rights to women. They were able to be elected and elect. And that was also a significant development for modern Turkey. And if Turkey is today different from other Middle Eastern countries, it has a lot to do with Mustafa Kemal's reforms and understanding.
It's astonishing, really, what he did. So, you mentioned all the things, but, he also changed Turkish numerals to, the ones that we'll use, which obviously have an Arabic origin. So he changed the numbers. He founded universities. I presume he needed to, because of all those illiterate university professors. The idea that you can learn a new language within 5 to 10 days, which is sort of said off the cuff, but within a couple of months this happened. The industrialization of Turkey, I don't know, it is astonishing. And then of course the Turkification of Turkey. So in 1930, we're going to stop calling Constantinople.
That's incredibly important.
We're going to stop calling Smyrna, we're going to call it Izmir. So basically the use of Turkish names and names, because many places in the old Ottoman Empire had multiple names depending on which group, or whether you're Greeks or Turkish ancestry. And he changed that. So from now on, it's going to be Turkish names across. And this was part of a kind of cultural nationalism, which obviously still remains controversial, because it went hand in hand with the denial of rights to Kurdish minorities, for example, who would be expected to speak Turkish. And there's obviously been a massive legacy because of that as well. But, to go back to, I wouldn't call them positive aspects, but look at the primary legacy of a reformer, someone who, like Napoleon, really wants to get things done and change things in a blistering hurry. The 1920s is astonishing, really. And then at the end of it all, there's also his other fundamental maxim, which is, I think it's peace at home, peace in the world, the kind of keeping Turkey neutral. So being strong, fighting the French out of the various bits they're trying to claw away in Syria, but actually also keeping out of what's coming, which of course is the Second World War. And he, even though he's dead by the time it happens, the strength of his shadow and his legacy on Turkey, which of course you can still feel today, kept Turkey out.
Can I add something? That's an incredibly important point about the Turkification. For example, he got rid of all the Arabic and Persian words. But when you listen to him, he was an Ottoman officer, so he used lots of Arabic words and Persian words, but he very deliberately got rid of them. So he was a great lover of Ottoman classical music. But in Turkish radios, poor inhabitants of Istanbul and Turkey had to listen Western music. So there's an incredible contradiction about the man as well. He was a product of the Ottoman Empire, obviously, but he saw a direction that he liked, and he forced people, whether they liked it or not, to Westernization and Europeanization. That peace at home, peace abroad was a foundational philosophy for his international politics, and he deliberately stayed out of the Middle Eastern politics. Some people, looking back retrospectively, actually blame him, for this non-involvement. They believe that Turkey could have had a positive impact on Middle Eastern countries throughout the 30s and 40s. Because when you think about it, all the rulers, all the new elite of Iraq, Syria, Egypt, and of course Israel, the first two presidents of Israel were graduates of Istanbul law faculty. These were Ottoman officers, and they had a lot in common with Mustafa Kemal. But he looked at the West and kind of turned his back to the Middle East, which comes back to Turkey with a revenge right now. It's almost ironical.
That's so fascinating, actually. I didn't realize. I'm very interested. So Kemal himself, he died very young, 57, of cirrhosis of the liver. So he liked a drink, but he wasn't a chronic alcoholic, was he? Or was he? I don't know.
Difficult to say. I think at one point he drank a lot.
There's a great line in one biography I read about him where it describes, I think, a French or British diplomat seeing him and seeing him at sort of 3 a.m, surrounded by young women drinking heavily. And he says, look, this guy's 53. He's not going to last very long if he keeps doing this. But he was a private drinker. He was fundamentally irreligious. He had no faith, which, obviously he carried on for his blueprint for the state. And he was a revolutionary, but he was also kind of an elitist. this sort of officer class elitist who he said, you said it's like a communist revolution, but not going to be a dictatorship of the workers. We're not going to drag the elite down. We're going to drag the common man up to the elite. And this is his level of ambition. And once again, you go back to the point I made earlier. This is a guy who is fundamentally unknown in this country, in Britain. He's kind of, he's hugely influential. And as Murat said, the Turkey we see today is fundamentally the Turkey that he gave us.
Yes, well, I wanted to ask about that, Murat, and I'm really interested in your view here. So for two things, really. One is, how does the modern Turkey look back on the First World War, the events of the First World War? I mean, one thing we've not discussed, and I don't know, we won't go into great detail about this, but there was genocide in Armenia that's, I don't think is really addressed today in Turkey. And then the other thing I wanted to ask you was how Ataturk is viewed today. Erdogan is a new, strong leader. Is he in any way similar?
The First World War in Turkey today, I don't think it's remembered at all. People don't talk about it. I mean, maybe Çanakkale, the Gallipoli campaign has a great heroism, but not that much either. When I lived in the UK, I was so struck by the remembrance of the Great War. It was still a big deal, that people would talk and people would remember. In Turkey, I think we have short memories. We don't remember that. People, I don't want to say completely forgot. Obviously, you studied at your primary school, in your secondary school. That's pretty much it. I don't think that it has anything to do. It doesn't come up in conversations, let's say. It's not part of people's worldview. People don't remember it. They might remember Cyprus, but that's pretty much it. I don't think it goes back further than that. The Armenian genocide, the Armenian issue is extremely complicated for Turkey. For some weird reason, because it happened during the Ottoman Empire, and Turkey could have easily said we had nothing to do with it. It was the Ottoman Empire, and we got rid of them. They take it to the heart. It is an important political issue. I think at one point it was better in the 2000s, early 2000s. There was a room for discussion. There were conferences. There were people who were willing to engage and talk about it in an open manner. But in the last 10 years or so, with the changing political atmosphere, I think it became one of the taboos as well. About Erdogan, he is a very divisive figure. There are people who really hate him. There are people who really love him. So in that regard, I don't think he's going to be another Ataturk. There are people who hate Ataturk, mind you. But I would say they're in the minority. And Turkish people, when they look back, they have mostly positive things to say about Mustafa Kemal. Whereas with Erdogan, I think, of course, the history will tell, but the story is going to be slightly different because he's such a divisive figure. This is not to deny his stamp in or on Turkey for the last 2 decades. He had been an extremely important politician. He was able to rule longer than Mustafa Kemal himself. But his legacy is going to be more complicated.
I mean, there's obviously other chief differences between them. There's many differences between them, but there's obviously Erdogan's strong faith. His religious faith is something which he wears and he exhibits, and which influences his ideas about the future of the Turkish state, which he's changed as well. And there's also Erdogan's kind of, neo-Ottomanism. His idea that Turkey can be more assertive in the world and have a position as a power broker, within the Middle East, within Russia, over Ukraine. These are kind of different things that he's really pushed. And I think, again, probably, they're amongst the more controversial things that he's been involved in, I imagine.
Yes, with Turkey as a NATO member and, as you say, increasingly assertive foreign policy-wise, I'm interested to know, Murat, your view on how Turkey views itself in the future. Is it going to be increasingly a big player in the region, both in the Middle East and also vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine?
Turkish, we have an expression like a watermelon. And when you look at the election results, actually, you see this very clearly. Half of the country supports Erdogan and in his vision of neo-Ottomanism. I mean, his neo-Ottomanism, how realistic it is another question. But definitely it's there, and it kind of shitty conversations probably. The other half is very secular. They don't want to have anything to do with the Middle East. They are looking at the West. They are product of the Turkish, modern Turkish Republic. They are more secular. They are not religious. Even if they are religious, they really want to see a division between religion and politics. And they feel like, this religious, political Islam is a disaster. I think the most important issue will be the economics. People might stop supporting Erdogan, not because of his ideology, but because of the economic mess that he created. So if you're going to survive, you are not going to be a big player in the region, that's for sure. And people, whatever we say about, how uneducated people are and how they are not really reading the politics, how they are clueless, but they are clever enough to know that if you don't have a strong economy, you are not going to be a big player. And then it means that Erdogan's promises, they are meaningless. So if he can take Turkey out of this economic mess, he might have a positive impact or positive legacy, but I seriously doubt that very much.
Well, this has been an absolute education for me, really hugely enjoyable. So I thank you so much, both Alec and Murat. So listeners, there are links for Alec's novel, After the Flood, and I've also put a link in, Murat, for your book, The Emergence of Public Opinion, State and Society in the Late Ottoman Empire. Murat, that's the academic publisher has attempted to price you out of the market here. It always upsets me when they put such vast fees on these books, which I'm sure is hugely entertaining.
I think it is the price for the hardcover. There is also paperback, which is more affordable. But I don't know about entertaining. I mean, sometimes when I look back, I find it more or less unreadable. Sometimes I like it. But, it's an academic book.
I'm just going to say, we've managed to have this conversation. We've spoken for the best part of, half an hour to an hour about the end of the Ottoman Empire and Ataturk and other things. And we've not mentioned Kemal Ataturk's decision to ban the fez or the turban, which was a sort of totemic symbol of Turkishness, but was in itself a symbol of modernity introduced as part of the kind of Tanzimat in the 1830s, if memory serves. Is that correct, Murat? The fez was a symbol of the future once?
It was after 1826, abolition of the Janissaries by Mahmud II. And people reacted to it badly. They did not want to wear it. And again, as you said, it was just an imposition on people. But it was internalized and it became the symbol of the Ottoman Empire. And when Mustafa Kemal showed up with his Western hat, with his Western top hat, people were horrified. And it became a big and controversial issue. It's even today, people would talk about it, that how he removed fez, which is supposed to, when you pray, it is, it's brimless, so you are able to put your forehand to the ground, the symbol of Islam and Muslim Ottoman Empire. But again, it was an imposition which happened, as Alec pointed out, in the late 1820s.
Well, I have a huge amount of sympathy for those people railing against the call to prayer being translated into Turkish and the banning of the fez. The banning of the fez is a terrible, terrible change.
I like it, yeah. I wish it was socially more acceptable.
Yes, well, that's a very good way to end it, Alec. Thank you. Far better than my attempt. And so this just leads me to say thank you once again.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you so much for listening. Plenty more great history to come, including the SAS in Italy, the liberation of Paris, Hitler's cronies, and much more. So please do subscribe and follow if you're listening on Spotify or Apple. And if you can give a generous rating, that would be most kind. But in the meantime, thank you and good night.